Hi, everyone. This week we are talking about Ben Jonson, so let's jump right in. All right, so he's born in 1572 and dies in 1637. So he is going to be overlapping with his kind of the person he's constantly compared to as second best, Shakespeare. Um, yeah, so we actually know a lot more about Ben Jonson than Shakespeare, which is kind of interesting. Shakespeare, like I said, there's like a lot of gaps in his life. There's a lot of mysteries about his education. With Ben Jonson, we actually know a little bit more. We know he was born about a month after his dad passed away. His dad was a London clergyman. He ended up becoming educated through the kindness of one of some family friend who sent him to Westminster, which is also where Queen Elizabeth was educated. But when he turned 16, there was really nothing for him to do except for go fight in the Netherlands. So he joined English troops there. Later, he apprenticed with his stepfather, who was a bricklayer, which is like a good middle class job. And so we know he was like, he was doing okay. His childhood was probably not like super impoverished, or anything like that. And then so anyway, so he seemed to have hated that job because he married before his apprenticeship was over, which wasn't a thing that you were allowed to do. You weren't allowed to marry until you were kind of had established yourself economically. And so he married someone, and then at that point, his apprenticeship ended. It seemed like it wasn't a mistake. Like maybe he had intended for that to happen, because he wanted to, write. So anyway, he has this like, you know, huge reputation in England. In his lifetime, even he achieved great success. He wrote masques for King James. Um, some of which are on horrifying subjects. So if you're curious about just how offensive some of these masks could be, yeah, feel free. I included a link here, but we're not going to get into it today because he's not really famous for that. He's really much more famous for his comedies. Um, and so, yeah, he wrote some plays that got him into big trouble, though, despite, some of his connections and education. He wrote some seditious plays. The Isle of Dogs, which is now lost, not to be confused with the Wes Anderson movie. And then I don't actually know how to pronounce the second one. And then Eastward Ho. And so these three poems are, oh my gosh, these three plays, they landed him in jail. And actually, while he was in jail, that's when he met a Catholic priest. And even though he did not come from a Catholic background, and this was not a good time to be Catholic in England, it was very, very controversial, right? And the climate was hostile towards Catholics. He converted to Catholicism. Um, so yeah, so we know a lot about him. Like I said, he had Shakespeare acting in some of his plays, potentially. We know that Shakespeare's company performed his plays. But we also know that, and we also, by the way, we know Ben Jonson was a terrible actor. We also know that he actually killed another actor in a duel. This was in 1598. And so it's not like, crime of passion or murder in kind of the more traditional sense, but it was a duel. But still, despite that, he should have been executed. Now, he was able to find kind of a loophole, which is that there was this old medieval law still in place. Um, I can't remember what it's called, but it was written for clergymen to be able to escape, severe punishment. And so if you spoke Latin, you were able to be forgiven, like be exonerated essentially, or have your sentence reduced. And so he brought that up and he did have his sentence reduced. He wasn't executed, but he was branded on his thumb and he lost all of his possessions at that point. And so it was like uh, you know, a huge personal blow, right? But he did kill someone. Um, so yeah, kind of despite that, despite a lot of ups and downs, a lot of rivalry and bitterness. Like he at the beginning of Volpone, we didn't read this, but in his prologue, he has these like biting criticisms of John Marston and Thomas Dekker, who were other playwrights at the time, who he just like kind of he's really clearly digging at them. He's not naming them, but he is talking about them, and it's like written into the play that would be performed on stage in a way that was so clearly targeting and talking about them. And so yeah. Okay. So anyway, he experiences a fire late in his life and loses his library, and a lot of his possessions. He, after King James dies, he doesn't have these kind of connections to the royal court. He's not getting these commissions, and so he essentially dies in poverty. He was having he had a series of strokes, that eventually led to his death. And despite that, he continued to write. These plays that he was writing towards the end of his life are not ones that he's famous for, or really, some have even really criticized them as showing like a decline in his artistic talent. But he did continue to write basically up into his death, and he was buried at Westminster Abbey. And there's like a little weird detail about this too, which is that he was buried vertically. And then some people say that that's because he was so impoverished at the end of his life. And then some people say it's because he wanted to be buried within a certain, proximity to like royalty or something. So anyway, it's a lot we know about him and still a lot of questions. Okay, so I want us to really focus on Volpone, and that's because this is one of his most famous works. And I think just kind of importantly too, he really is known for these comedies. This is really what he's known for. This one in particular, Volpone or The Fox, as it's also titled. And The Alchemist. That's the other one that's really famous. He has some others that are famous-ish, but these two are the ones that are the most famous, and probably Volpone the very most. I kind of went back and forth, but I've read Volpone for class a long time ago, and I thought if I learned it then, it's probably still relevant. Okay. So Act One, we have Volpone. He is feigning illness, like severe illness, right? He's pretending he's on his deathbed. And he's doing this in order to get gifts from people who want to get his inheritance. He doesn't have a spouse or children, who would receive this inheritance. And so he is relying upon the greed of those around him, to build his own wealth. And so he is also very greedy. It's kind of hard to find somebody to root for in here until Celia is introduced, right? Um, we find out that one of the characters in the play who's really trying to win this inheritance, Corbaccio. Nope, Corvino, I mean. Corvino, he is married to Celia, who is supposed to be like one of the most beautiful women ever. Okay. And so, um, because, because Corvino is so jealous, he keeps Celia sort of locked away. She's not really like able to go out. Um, and so Volpone hears about Celia and how beautiful she is. He really wants to see her. So he wants to go visit her. He knows he has to leave because she can't come to him. But then Mosca, his servant, reminds him, well, you can't go looking like that because you're pretending you're dying. And if you look healthy, then everybody's going to know you're faking it. So he goes in disguise and he does this whole like con presentation, in front of Celia's window in kind of in the square. And he's getting all these people responding. And then Celia tosses down her handkerchief. Okay. And so this is like kind of a movement forward in the plot. Corvino is furious and he punishes Celia. He chases Volpone away. He doesn't know it's Volpone. But later he goes to Volpone, and after, Mosca's talking about how Volpone might give his inheritance to somebody else who's offered a woman to him, he realizes that his best option is to offer Celia to Volpone, and he does so willingly. Like for him to have sex with Celia, not for him to marry her. Act three, so there's this one of the other characters, Corbaccio. He's this older guy, and he's old like Volpone, but he is in total denial about his age. He can't hear very well, and so there's a lot of jokes about that at his expense, where Mosca's talking about him when he's right there, but he can't hear, and so it's kind of like an aside to the audience, and we're all kind of laughing at him. And so Corbaccio has a son, Bonario, and, so his wealth is supposed to go to Benario. Well, he's looking at Volpone and he's like, well, Volpone looks worse for the wear. He's probably going to go any day now. Meanwhile, I'm still in great health, even though, again, he's in denial. And so Mosca convinces him to change his inheritance or give his inheritance to Volpone instead of Benario, his son, because he's like, it doesn't really matter. Like, Volpone's about to die, and then you'll get all the wealth, and then you can give it to whoever you want. But so anyway, so this is he does end up giving his inheritance to Volpone. Corvino gives Celia to Volpone. It really looks like everything is going Volpone's way, but the problem is that Benario is furious because he's just lost his inheritance. And so when Volpone is trying to essentially he's trying to rape Celia. Bonario comes in and saves her. And so then these two, we finally have two characters to kind of root for, right? They seem to actually be good people, or at least not actively doing anything horrible. Okay. And at this point too, we realize Bonario has seen Volpone kind of throw away his disguise in order to attempt seduction of Celia. And so his con is up. Benario knows what's going on. But so then Benario and Celia take Volpone to court. They argue, that Volpone should be punished. And but the problem is that these other guys who are trying to take Volpone's inheritance are still arguing for Volpone. Like they're still siding with him. And so it ruins the testimony of Benario and Celia. But as a result of all of his bad decisions and behavior, Volpone gets sick for real. And at this point, he decides, you know what, I'm going to do one last prank and I'm going to give it up because I realize this is bad for me or whatever. Okay. And so then he pretends he's died and he has Mosca tell everyone that he has inherited everything. And Mosca kind of presents himself as a gentleman now instead of as a servant. What ends up happening then is that everything comes crashing down because now, everybody's turning their back on everyone else. And so Volpone and Mosca are punished. It seems imprisoned probably, and then Corbaccio, Voltore, who I hadn't even mentioned, and Corvino are all, also everybody's basically getting punished and betrayed at this point. And so it ends with it would be tragedy if we were rooting for any of these characters, but since all of them are horrible except for Benario and Celia, who are not being punished, seems great. All right. So if this form feels at all familiar to you, it might be because it's a satire, okay? And so we talked about satire before when we were talking about Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. That was an estate satire, and so a lot of that was talking about things like class or like different types of roles that people play in society, and kind of yeah, talking about corruption and things within those roles. This is going to be a city comedy, and so a satire, just as a reminder, I have the definition here and a link to Britannica where it goes into a lot more detail. But this is an artistic form in which human or individual vices, follies, abuses, or shortcomings are held up to censure by means of ridicule, derision, burlesque, irony, parody, caricature, which is definitely going on here, caricature, or other methods, sometimes with an intent to inspire social reform. All right, and so that's at least what Jonson's telling us Volpone is about, is an attempt to share a moral for with these good intentions of reform, right? And the moral is clearly about greed, right? Because everybody in here is so greedy and they've ruined all of their lives because of greed. A city comedy, more specifically, is going to be a comic drama, and particularly in London in the 17th century, so this time period we're talking about, characterized by its contemporary urban subject matter and its portrayal, often satirical, of middle-class life and manners. Okay, and so instead of focusing on estate satire, where we're talking about these like different classes and kind of the way that each of them has their own corruption and things like that, here we're focusing pretty specifically on middle-class life in like London, right? Okay. Another important kind of, and maybe the most important thing to kind of think about with Volpone is that this is a comedy of humors. And basically, we could go into this for so long. There's so much about this, but basically, there's this like medieval theory of humors where, and it was also in the Renaissance. This is a medical theory that they had at the time that they believed that there's sort of these four liquids. Ugh, the worst word that they could use. Okay. These four liquids that need to be balanced within the body for a person to be like healthy and of like sound mind. So this is like not just like a physical feeling. This is like your mental health and well-being and your good character are influenced by these liquids. And the liquids are, and I'm so sorry, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, which is also referred to as choler, and black bile, which is referred, is melancholy. And so, yeah, you want these all to be balanced. And so, what we are seeing with the characters in Volpone is that they have unbalanced humors. And so, when you have these unbalanced humors, it can produce a person who's more, depressed if they have too much black bile, right? Or they can have too much lust if they have too much, and I'm trying to remember which one is the lust one. I think it's yellow bile. And so there's all of these different, and they had these theories about men and women had different amounts of these liquids. And so anyway, so all of his characters supposedly have these unbalanced liquids in their body, and that's why they have these bad characters. If you want to learn more about this, by the way, it's really fascinating. There's kind of this this is it's not just an article, it's like they have a lot of images and things that they've gotten out of an archive. Okay. Another element of Volpone that's important, and this I think is another thing that it's kind of famous for and could be like on a test. Not necessarily even in my class, but like if anybody's ever talking about Volpone, this is likely something they're going to talk about, is that it has this beast fable influence. All of the characters are named after animals. And so for thinking about like a beast fable, Aesop's Fables is probably like the most famous version of this. It's going to be stories that have animal characters and it has a moral. Um, and so Volpone means fox, and it's, Ben Jonson, he named this play The Fox as well. So I mean, it's kind of referred to as both. And we can see how Volpone is. He's greedy, he's a trickster. There's kind of this element of the character that, might be associated with foxes at this time period, even if it's not really what foxes are like. Mosca means fly, and so he keeps referring to himself as a parasite. He's a servant. Voltore is a vulture, and he plays a lawyer. Corvino, which I mean the joke's already built in. Corvino is a carrion crow. He plays a merchant, and Corbaccio, that means raven. And he's a wealthy old man. So the three birds, these are what's the right word? They are like scavengers. And so it kind of fits in with like carrion crows, for example, and all of these, they tend to like they will come in and I was trying to remember which I read a note about this. And I tried to find it, but I couldn't find it today. Carrion crows will actually fight foxes. I literally found that quote for their food. Like, so if they've killed an animal and they're eating, then a carrion crow will literally come in and try to take it away from a fox. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different examples of this. You can see how the kind of animal characteristics are supposed to be embodied in these very caricature, characters. And if you want to read more about this, I have some links here. Let's hope my laptop doesn't die. Okay. I also wanted to tell you that Volpone starts with an acrostic. I thought this was kind of cool, and I totally forgot about this. Otherwise, I would have had you read it. But at the very beginning, before even the prologue, there is what he has is called an argument. And this is coming from the Roman playwright Plautus. And I have a link here if you want to read more about him. But basically, an acrostic, you might have done this already. I feel like I did this in like elementary school. If you write like your name and then sort of like a description for each of like based on each of the letters of your name. So he does it with Volpone Jonson at the very beginning of the play. Volpone, childless rich, feigns sick, despairs, offers his state to hopes of several heirs. So you can see it goes Volpone. And it basically tells you like the whole play, which is kind of fun. And it was probably performed on stage at the very beginning. Okay, so let's move on from Volpone. So we can talk. This is like a huge shift because this song is probably Jonson's most famous work. Um, and it is not the kind of thing he's most famous for, if that makes sense. So he's much more famous, I think, for his comedies, these satires, these comedies of humors, right? But he has this song to Celia that is so famous. It's also known as Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes. And that's the first line, right? It's a love poem, an ode praising Celia, which, by the way, is the same name as the woman in Volpone. And this Celia comes from the Latin word for heaven, and so he clearly has puts a lot of thought into names, right? The poem describes Celia's love as almost supernatural. Her love is better than the nectar of the gods. She could keep a wreath alive with her breath. Um, and so if you want, you can find like literal translations. This is coming. I thought these were really funny when I was looking at literal translations of the song. I found, some descriptions of things that were, since they were literal, sounded kind of silly. But yeah, so yeah, he asks her to, or he sends her a wreath, and she breathes on it, and then it doesn't die, right? So yeah, so she has this sort of supernatural, like super, um, almost inhuman, uh, persona here, which later poets will probably find criticism about, right? Because of the way that puts women into a box. Okay, so this song has had a very, very long life. So, he's writing this in the 1600s, but it's been performed as recently as I could find in 2020's movie Emma with Anya Taylor-Joy. So, and I completely forgot about this until I was kind of looking at the history of the song. Dean Martin also performed it. I could only find a live version of that, but it's included here. Johnny Cash performed it. Paul Robeson performed it. And so it's really kind of an amazing lifespan of such a short song, but one that is so clearly romantic that it has had such a long life. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about with Jonson is his poem about Shakespeare, truly the longest poem title in history. Probably not, but it feels like it every time I type it out. Um, so this was published in Shakespeare's first published volume of works. Okay, and Ben Jonson, one of the things he's kind of famous for is that he is like I don't even know how to say this. He is one of the first playwrights to like publish his stuff. And he put it in a volume called Works. And the only people who really did that were like kings, and they would do that with like their speeches and stuff. And so anyway, it's just kind of interesting that's kind of what he's known for. So anyway, after Shakespeare died, they put together a folio with his works, and a bunch of poets wrote these sorts of like elegies and odes to Shakespeare. And this is Jonson's, and I think probably, I mean, I don't know of any of the other poems in there. So I think this is the most famous one. Scholars actually kind of have had disagreements throughout the years about how to interpret this poem. Should we take it literally and earnestly, like he really thinks Shakespeare is the best and of his, in his art, and he'll live on forever? Or is there like some sarcasm here? Especially there's a line about how Shakespeare isn't very good at Latin. And it's kind of like, even though he wasn't good at Latin and Greek, he still was a pretty good writer, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, but that's a line that gets brought up a lot as like because Shakespeare, he wasn't as educated as Jonson, even though, neither of them had a ton of education. Jonson did get an honorary master's from Oxford. But he didn't study for a master's. And so I think another thing to kind of keep in mind here is that Jonson is often described as second to Shakespeare as the best dramatist. And so it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have some sense of that rivalry. But at the same time, Jonson had incredible success within his lifetime. He's considered the first poet laureate of England. And yeah, he got that honorary master's, right? And so it's kind of hard to tell. A lot of people believe that they were friends. A lot of people believe that they were rivals, and some people think that they were probably both. And so it's really kind of hard to know. Probably the most famous line from this poem is "He was not of an age but for all time." And so if you've heard that, that's what this is coming from. And you know, it's often used to describe Shakespeare. And so it's kind of if this was supposed to be ironic, then maybe the greatest irony is that this is you know, what is often referred to with absolute earnestness when describing Shakespeare. And if you want to read more about that, you can read, there's a bunch of great notes in this Cambridge version of the poem. That's it for this week, y'all. I will see you all next week.